So I'd like to talk about bias for a second. So things are a powder keg at the moment, and sharing any news story is kind of like tiptoeing through a minefield, especially the type of news story that I had to share today. You never really know which adjective you're going to use or which microfacial expression you might display that just totally throws someone off. I had one person tell me that I'm a disgrace to the state of Mississippi. I had another one tell me that I had to stick to just the happy historical stories. And that was after being very, very careful to try to walk right down the middle of the road. So tonight I wanted to talk just a little bit about bias, because as humans it's something that every single one of us has, but we've somehow convinced ourselves that it's downright sinful. Now, I've said many, many times on here that I am a human being with bias. Now, some folks took that to mean just straight politics, but politics are just a fraction of what goes into how we see the world. It is so much more than just red versus blue. But one of the best examples that I've ever heard of how to describe bias is this idea of a news photographer at a house fire. Now, there's nothing innately political about this situation. They're just there to cover the situation for the news. But there are 360 degrees around them of places they can point that camera, and they have to choose just one. Wherever they decide to point that camera in that moment is determined by their bias. That bias might be influenced by their experience in knowing how to capture the essence of a scene, or knowing what part of that fire is going to evoke the most emotion. Or maybe it's just a technical experience, knowing what will have the best color, what will have the best lighting. They have to choose that one single angle, that one single frame that they believe best captures the story. And it doesn't come from a place of an evil bias or a desire to mislead the world. But by capturing that one instance in that one frame, their bias influences how you, the viewer or the reader, understands the story. My personal bias, for example, is built from hundreds and hundreds of personal experiences. For example, growing up in a conservative Christian household with a steady diet of Rush Limbaugh and Dr. Dobson. I could still to this day probably just hear the title of the Adventures in Odyssey episode and I'd be able to tell you the entire plot. The churches my family attended as a child, that impacts my bias. Seeing my dad chased out of some of those churches, that impacts my bias. My economic experience growing up. My economic experience now, my work history, my reading list, my phobias, the conservative friends that I grew up with in childhood, and the liberal friends that I met during college. Every single one of these added a brick to the building that is my perspective of the world. Every single one of those contributed to my personal bias today. Some of those biases I'm not even aware exist. And that's true of every single one of us. Where you grew up, what your parents believed, what your friends believed, how you were treated growing up. All of this built you, and you as a human have a bias because of it. It's not a dirty word. It's not something that we have to stamp out, because without that bias, you would not be you. The trick is just realizing that it's there and not letting it dictate your reality. For example, me today, part of my bias is that I absolutely despise bullies. I don't get angry at very many things, but bullies make me infuriated. So anything that a bully says, I'm instantly going to think is false, even if it's not. My interpretation of the gospel is another. I take Christ's words very literally, and I believe that we're called to love each other unconditionally, that we're not supposed to worry about somebody maybe taking advantage of us, but to give when we're asked to give. That's another thing that impacts my bias and my view of politics. But I worked very hard to try to be at least aware of these biases. Not to change them or to get rid of them necessarily, but just to be aware that they're there so that I can provide the adequate counterbalance. I may find more viewpoints that I agree with on a more progressive news channel, but simply knowing that I want to agree with those views should drive me to pay extra close attention to the sources. In other words, I shouldn't be blindly accepting something simply because it fits with the way that I want to see the world. Have I mastered this? Hell no. The closest I'll ever get to being neutral is when I'm dead. And even then, my tombstone, whatever's written on there, will probably betray some sort of bias one way or another. But my ultimate goal is to develop a perspective of the world that uses both eyes, because that's the only way we get depth perception. My goal is to avoid the echo chambers, because that's where you get lost. My challenge to myself is to look at every fact that I can find, even the ones that make me uncomfortable, because those are often the ones that I need to see the most. My opinion may not change, but if anything, it's stronger and it's better because of that extra attention. And that's my challenge to y'all. Just to take a moment to be honest with yourself about your biases. Not to look at them as something that's wrong with you, just to be aware of them as something that's part of you. Ask yourself, what is it that my personal biases are keeping me from seeing? And then explore it. I truly think that you'll find it makes life a whole lot more beautiful.